Okay, everybody stand by.
The recording has started.
My name is Dennis Speed, and we, on behalf of the LaRouche Political Action Committee, we want to welcome everybody to our first dialogue with Linda LaRouche and Fireside Chat of 2020. A lot to talk about. This year, we have a particular slogan we're using, which is called Think Like Beethoven, Think Like LaRouche. We're going to make it very clear to you, I think, in the course of the next hour or so, why we're taking that slogan and what it has to do with you and what it has to do with the fight we're in the United States. Now, we're poised to change the thinking of the entire country, but by providing the tools by which people can actually think for themselves about not really what look like right now to them, maybe a jumble of different matters, international, domestic, so on. Really, there's one method to getting at this, and this is what Lyndon LaRouche worked his entire life to teach his associates and also conveyed in America in various forms of policy statements and policy initiatives, from what he did in the SDI back in the 1980s to what he did consistently in terms of economic proposals of various types. So there's a certain kind of process of organizing around that method of thinking that we're going to take up tonight. That process is going to, in particular, span a period of the next 16 and a half weeks, during which we will be organizing for an international conference. But within that 16 weeks, there are several inflection points, the most immediate, of course, being the ongoing coup process, mistakenly called the impeachment process, which we are going to turn upside down through our actions in the short term. Now, we have a kind of objective, which is a strategic objective, which is to insist that the president not be interfered with in his attempt to meet with President Vladimir Putin, who has invited President Donald Trump to go to Moscow for the May commemorations of the 75th anniversary of World War II. But that is really a strategic objective that has a lot more to do with the immediate fate of the world on questions of nuclear war, nuclear weapons, and foreign policy, and the impending or looming international economic and financial crisis in which the world finds itself. It's important to think about the difference between the way that Russia experienced World War II, China experienced World War II, and the United States experienced it. Russia, which was attacked, of course, by Hitler, lost between 24 and 30 million people. China lost 20 million people. And the United States lost about 500,000 people, but was a nation that went into the war with a certain kind of economic capability and came out of the war with the greatest economic capability of human history. That, as with the case of the 1861-65 war, called the Civil War in the United States, we came out of the war a greater economic power than we went into it. And this genius of the American system is exactly what needs to be unleashed in the present circumstances. And the difference is that you actually have, in the form of Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, presidents of nations that are prepared not only to think in those terms, but have already themselves been exhibiting that kind of expression of collaboration around the Belt and Road Initiative that it was Franklin Roosevelt that actually sought to create in the immediate aftermath of World War II, 1945. Roosevelt died on April 12th. The first meeting between Russian and American troops was on April 25th at the Elbe River in Germany. And then May 9th, in this case, 7th through 9th, the period of victory in Europe was declared back in 1945. And so the idea is that should be what occurs, and that over the arc of that period, in order for that to occur, we're going to have to do something in the United States which is sort of equivalent to the actions taken by patriotic Americans in Europe on the battlefield of between December of 1944 and May of 1945. That's going to be what we're going to have to do in our own political way with respect to our committees of correspondence and with respect to what we do with our emergency alert system and so on. But to do that, we've been very concerned to make clear to people, there's a concept called think like Beethoven. Now, in order to talk about that, first of all, there are several things that we don't have to do right now. I don't have to say more because we happen to have had a concert yesterday, I think it was, in Leesburg, Virginia. And the person that we're going to start us off with tonight, Mike Billington, did something when he was a political prisoner. He formed what was called the Prisoner's Chorus. He'll say much more about that. This is a portion refers to something from the Beethoven opera Fidelio. And that Beethoven opera, Fidelio, is something that many of us view every New Year's Day, every year. And the story of Lyndon LaRouche and Helga Sepp LaRouche in terms of the way that Lyndon LaRouche was treated as a political prisoner and what was done and needs to be done to free Lyndon LaRouche through exoneration, to play the role that he needs to play in America today, is very much captured in this Beethoven opera. Rather than me say more, at this point, I want to turn this over to Mike Billington, and I want to make it clear that when we look at the international situation, when we look at what we have to do right now today, we believe that you can do through the method of thinking Lyndon LaRouche taught us, you can bring together the principles by which you change a culture, changing people's minds, and therefore changing policy. It's all one idea. So, Mike, let me yield the floor to you, and then we'll continue with Barbara Boyd once you've finished.
Okay, thanks, Dennis. So we had a concert, New Year's Day conference. Actually, it's the fourth year in a row we've had a New Year's Day conference here in Leesburg. And it's worth mentioning that when we first moved to Leesburg from New York City, our national headquarters, we were subjected to massive harassment by basically the establishment networks within Leesburg, which went on for years and years, including their participation in the incarceration of LaRouche and myself and a number of our associates. So the fact that we've had these New Year's Day concerts of classical culture on New Year's Day, rather than football, which is what most Americans do on New Year's Day, is extremely important. And what happened yesterday, it's really quite extraordinary. We had about 130 people from the community, many of whom saw newspaper ads or saw flyers or were told by their political clubs or word of mouth, who came to this concert. The lovely church in which we are allowed to perform these concerts was packed, and it was a concert of Beethoven and Brahms and other great classical choruses, and some wonderful professionals who volunteer their time to come and play with us because they love to work with us because of our commitment to the idea of the aesthetic education of the population. And the fact that this many people from all walks of life showed up in Leesburg, Virginia, to watch a Schiller Institute community chorus concert, I think in itself reflects the transformation that's taken place in the United States and the potential of the LaRouche message, which no longer is believed by a majority of the American people. The slanders and attacks that have characterized the treatment of LaRouche over these years, including his incarceration, is no longer believed. So we'll have more on this that we'll send out later. The issue of Fidelio, as Helga has emphasized, is very personal for her, given what Dennis just said about the fact that the incarceration of Lyndon LaRouche, like in the opera Fidelio, in which the Florestan is a political a Republican, you might say, is incarcerated by an evil man, Pizarro, and his wife disguises herself as a young man and goes to work as the helper to the jailer in the prison in which she suspects her husband is held. And through a series of things, it succeeds in overcoming the evil Pizarro and freeing her husband. So she's considered this very personal. It's also very personal to me. I spent 10 years in prison as a result of these LaRouche prosecutions, and my wife, Gail, at the time, was thrust into an international position in which she met with heads of state, people like Mahathir Mohamad in Malaysia and Hun Sen in Colombia, and the U.S. human rights courts and so forth in Europe. Not because she wanted to do this, and not because she was pleading for her dear husband, but because she was speaking about the injustice that had been done to this movement, because we were focused on reversing the decline of America into this British imperial degeneracy, political, economic, cultural, strategic degeneracy. And that's why we had been attacked. So she was very much my Leonora, or the Fidelio, as she disguised herself to be during my 10 years of incarceration. And it was not easy for her to do these things. It was extremely difficult. But while we were in prison, at one point, Paul Gallagher and I were together in one of the prisons, and we formed a chorus, a classical chorus of people who mostly had never sung anything, let alone classical music. And we sang Brahms and Beethoven and Bach and so forth. And at every point, every one of these people at some point afterwards came up to me and expressed to me the sense that they were just stunned by the fact that such beauty existed in the world, and that they themselves could participate in the creation of this kind of beauty, and that this is something which is true throughout America today. People being subjected to the degenerate and ugly culture of our violent and pornography-infested media, so-called entertainment, who once they have the experience of participating in, or even just being in the audience of this kind of a beautiful concert of great creative music, which appeals to the mind, not to the senses, except to the most advanced senses, the most profound senses, not the bodily senses that characterize animals, as opposed to the creative emotions that characterize the human mind, that they are uplifted, that they become capable of conceiving of themselves being part of doing what's necessary in a moment of great crisis in history to achieve what's required. So in that chorus, we performed what's called the prisoner's chorus from the Beethoven Fidelio, the moment at which Fidelio succeeds in getting the jailer to allow the prisoners out for a few moments to breathe fresh air and to think about the idea of freedom. And it was especially that the beauty of that piece that inspired these members of our prisoners' chorus to actually, like the prisoners in the prisoners' chorus of the opera, have a sense of freedom despite being locked up, because the freedom of the mind is superior to the physical freedom of being locked up. As unfortunately many people who are not in prison are locked up in the slavery of being imprisoned in the degenerate culture which is imposed upon most of the people in our nation, and many in Western Europe as well. So this is a moment at which I encourage all of you, if you have not, to listen to that opera. We'll send out a message to make sure you have access to some of the better performances available on YouTube. But it's something that is, in a certain sense, a requirement to be able to deal with the crisis we're facing today. At one point in the opera, in the dungeon, at which point they're about to kill her husband, and she, yet not revealed as his wife, still appearing to be the helper to the prisoner, offers her some bread and water. And there is a beautiful aria in which he sings, "Euch werde Lohn in besten Welten," you will be rewarded in a better world, which is also what I have engraved on her tombstone. So it's obviously very personal for all of us involved in this, but it's something which is universal in nature. So what I want to address tonight actually was requested by Helga several weeks ago, that in addressing this hysteria about China in this country and the lies which compare possibly even more disastrous than the lies about the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, the lies about the evil of what's going on in China, the Hong Kong freedom fighters who are nothing but radical terrorists burning down the city, and even more substantial, this Xinjiang Uyghur issue, which I'm sure you've all seen. The propaganda is that millions of Muslims have been locked up, forbidden to study their religion, locked up and thrown the key thrown away if they even have a passage of the Quran in their cell phone. Millions and millions of Uyghurs and so forth. Wild lies. I hope you've all seen our pamphlet, which says that the McCarthyite witch hunt against China and against the Chinese Americans is equally an attack on Donald Trump, who is committed to breaking this neocon British imperial divide of the world, ending the colonial wars in the Middle East and elsewhere, and bringing about friendship between the United States and Russia and China. As Dennis mentioned, Putin has invited Trump to attend the 75th anniversary of the meeting of Russian and U.S. troops at the Elbe in Germany, and on the 25th of April, as well as the celebration of the end of the war on May 9th in Moscow. And we are strongly encouraging President Trump to attend that meeting. And at the same time, President Trump has never succumbed to agreeing with the insane Congress, which has passed bills condemning China and sanctioning China for their mistreatment of the Muslims. Now, this is a country, mind you, which has committed the mass murder of hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of Muslims in Iraq and Libya and Syria in order to supposedly combat terrorism, and I'll get to that. But they condemn China for locking up these millions of Muslims. Well, first of all, it never happened. There were never millions. They were indeed interred in these camps, and as we've documented already, and most of you have probably seen, these were education camps. These were the young people after a spate of terrorism in China between 2009 and 2014, bombings, slashing, knifing of hundreds of people, killing of people. They thought that perhaps economic development would solve the problem, but Xi Jinping realized in 2014 that Xinjiang, which was the hub for the Belt and Road, after all, this was the area through which the rail routes connecting China with Central Asia and Europe were passing. There was massive development going on, but he realized it was not containing the terrorism, that the terrorists didn't give a damn about economic development. This was a mindless jihadi operation, which I'll get into in a minute. And he therefore took a very, very different approach than the West, which was under Bush and Obama, to bomb countries back to the Stone Age, supposedly to end terrorism, but actually creating more terrorists in the process. Instead, they locked up a number of the actual terrorists and provided an educational camp for the thousands and thousands of young men induced through the madrasas and the teaching of this Saudi-based Wahhabi terrorist form of Islam, which they were told not to study, but they were very much taught what realism was by the imams who were in the camps, along with the educational courses, the vocational courses to provide them with training for jobs when they got out, the average stay being about 8 months. And then just last month, on December 9th, they announced that the last of the people interred in these camps had been released, had graduated, as they say, and CGTN yesterday did a tour of the largest of these camps near Kashgar, showing that, in fact, it was empty. These are beautiful facilities. They're going to be turned into regular schools. So this is the actual truth of this. But what Helga wanted us to do, and I will try to do very briefly tonight, is to locate this attack on China as simply one aspect of an historic role by the British of creating and using Islamic jihadist terrorist networks in order to undermine sovereign nations, nationalist forces, which refuse to succumb to the British imperial dictates. So I'm going to go through it very quickly. I'm not going to focus on any one aspect of this. I'm going to go through a number of things very quickly. I don't expect you to sort of understand every one of them. If you have questions, you can. But the idea is to convey the overwhelming proof through the words of Winston Churchill and Maggie Thatcher and others that this was the intent of the British Empire, just as General Flynn had publicly identified the fact that Obama was funding and arming terrorists. And when he was questioned, you mean by mistake? General Flynn said, no, this is the intention to carry out regime change by openly arming terrorist networks. That's why he was attacked by Robert Miller. And this is true of the British throughout history. So this started way back in World War I. The war itself was launched by the British in order to destroy Germany and the Ottoman Empire. They were terrified that the Germans were moving to create a railroad to Baghdad, linking up Europe with Southwest Asia and potentially also with all of Asia. And there was much more to it, but the war was aimed at destroying that. They succeeded. Germany was defeated and destroyed. The Ottoman Empire was defeated and destroyed. And in the process, the caliphate of the Islamic world was shifted from Turkey to Arabia, which was under British control. And then over the coming period, they overthrew the government that they had been put in power in Arabia and supported instead, this was a sort of a normal Sunni institutional commitment by that leader. They instead supported Saud, S-A-U-D, what became the Saudi Arabia, who was a radical fundamentalist based on the ideas of Wahhab, which is what Wahhabism refers to, a radical fundamentalist ideology, a extreme form of Islam supporting jihadism and so forth. I think the best way to give you a sense of that is to read from the one of the most evil men in history, Winston Churchill, who said the following. This was a speech that he gave to the House of Commons. He described the Wahhabist networks, the Saud network, as, quote, austere, intolerant, well-armed, and bloodthirsty, that they hold as an article of duty as well as faith to kill all who do not share their opinions and to make slaves of their wives and children. Women have been put to death in Wahhabi villages for simply appearing in the streets. It is a penal offense to wear a silk garment. Men have been killed for smoking a cigarette. So this is Winston Churchill in an honest moment. Soon after that, he said, my admiration for Ibn Saud was deep because of his unfailing loyalty to us. So this is what you're dealing with the British. They know full well what they're supporting in their cooperation with the Saud family and the Saudi Arabian government. It was to use this kind of radical fundamentalism and jihadist terrorism in order to undermine any nationalist government which refused to toe the line as imposed. So that's that. Now, what happened after World War II? You had the Muslim Brotherhood created in Egypt in 1928. The British, of course, controlled Egypt at that time. They covertly supported the founding of the Muslim Brotherhood. Why? Because their theme was that the Quran is our constitution, i.e. no nation state, no sovereign countries, no communism or any other kind of nationalism. And this, of course, was exactly what they wanted, to overthrow the likes of Nasser and others later on. In India and Pakistan after World War II, you probably all know how India fought and won its freedom from the British Empire under the leadership of Gandhi and Nehru. But the British would not allow that to go through without creating the potential for permanent conflict. I hope you've all seen the movie Gandhi. It was made by the British, a British guy, but it's a very powerful film, and it demonstrates how the British supported Jinnah, who was the head of the Pakistan Muslim League, a fundamentalist Islamic character who insisted on dividing India, and despite Gandhi and Nehru fighting to keep India united, the British succeeded in dividing it and creating a permanent war conflict situation, which is not resolved yet today. Typical British. I've lived in Guyana at one point in the Peace Corps, where the same thing had happened. When they divided, when they granted independence, they did it by completely dividing the Indian and the Indian from India and the blacks from Africa, who had been brought over as slaves and indentured servants, created violent, bloody conflicts between them before they set free Guyana. This is the British method. In 1957 through 1965, the same thing was done to Indonesia. The open support for radical Islamic coup against Sukarno, the person who had fought for independence of Indonesia against the Dutch after World War II. The coup didn't work, but over the years they succeeded in creating a mass Muslim uprising against Sukarno and his base. Tens of thousands of people were slaughtered in one of the greatest bloodlettings of history, openly supported by the British and by the U.S. by this point, was openly allied with the British under the Dulles family and others, and the Australians who carried out this mass slaughter. So by the 1970s, the Saudis went into a vast expansion of Wahhabism around the world. They created thousands and thousands of mosques and madrasas, these Islamic schools, throughout the world. London became known as Londonistan, as the center for virtually every one of these Islamic jihadist movements. The British argued simply that what you call terrorists, we call freedom fighters. And this then led to 1979, when the British ran the Iran coup, overthrowing the Shah of Iran, putting Khomeini and the Shia Islamic fundamentalists in power. At the time, BBC was well recognized as the source of the attacks against the Shah, which rallied the nation against the Shah and brought in Khomeini, who had been in France. So at that time, Maggie Thatcher, who was already the Prime Minister in the UK, I'm going to read you a quote from her, just again to give you a sense that they know full well what they're doing here in supporting these fanatics in order to maintain the British Empire. Here's what she said in 1979. There was a tide of self-confidence and self-awareness in the Muslim world which preceded the Iranian Revolution and will outlast its present excesses. The West should recognize this with respect, not hostility. The Middle East is an area where we all have much at stake. It is our own interests, as well as the interests of the people in that region, that they build on their own deep religious traditions. Now, of course, here she doesn't mean Islam. She means Wahhabism, just as in Xinjiang, when they say they're not allowed to practice their religion. What they mean is that they're not allowed to practice this fundamentalist terrorist pseudo-religion, but in fact are encouraged to learn what real Islam is. And here, Maggie Thatcher is referring to their deep religious traditions as this fake Islam of Wahhabism. She continues, we do not wish to see them succumb to the fraudulent appeal of imported Marxism. So you see the intention there. Thatcher later said about Afghanistan that calling the rebels, calling them rebels who were fighting the Russian invasion in 1979, she said, this is a strange word to use to me of people who are fighting to defend their country against a foreign invader. Surely they are genuine freedom fighters fighting to free their country from an alien oppressor. Now, I ask you to consider if the British today, over these last 19 years of insane genocidal war in Afghanistan, if they say that the Taliban who are fighting against the American occupiers and the British occupiers of Afghanistan are freedom fighters. I think you know the answer to that question. So this was 79. That's when the Russians, there had been a pro-Russian regime in Afghanistan, and the Russians moved in against the Islamicist jihadist movement that was being organized against them by the British and by the U.S. under Zbigniew Brzezinski, Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, who was working with what was called the Bernard Lewis plan, Bernard Lewis being the top British Islamicist, whose idea was a arc of crisis, which LaRouche addressed it in his War over Asia video, which was to build radical Islamist regimes on the southern border of Russia and China, and in China, in order to bring down those regimes. So it's important to note that Brzezinski and the British were funding the Mujahideen, basically what became Al-Qaeda, in Afghanistan at least 6 months before the Russians invaded. Brzezinski even said, we're doing this because we want to draw Russia into their own Vietnam. And indeed, they succeeded in doing that, and then brought Islamic radicals from Saudi Arabia, Algeria, Philippines, Indonesia, all over the world. They gathered up people from the radical Wahhabi networks and brought them to Afghanistan, trained them, CIA and MI6, armed them, and set them to war against the Russians. The U.S. Congress, after a big fight, succeeded in voting to send Stinger missiles and other advanced weaponry to these jihadists. You might have seen the movie Charlie Wilson's War. The Congressman Charlie Wilson has succeeded in convincing the U.S. Congress that these were freedom fighters against the evil Russians. Please help us. And they indeed did send Stinger weapons, which were ultimately used against the U.S. by terrorists around the world. So we, the British, MI6, CIA, created Al-Qaeda. This is Al-Qaeda. The head of the Saudi intelligence at that time was Prince Turki, the brother of Prince Bandar, who was the Saudi ambassador to the U.S., who he and his wife funded several of the terrorists who ran the 9/11 attacks on the United States. So his brother, Prince Turki, was head of intelligence in Saudi Arabia from 1977. He personally sent Osama bin Laden to Afghanistan when the Russians invaded. The bin Laden family was a leading construction firm, a very wealthy firm in Saudi Arabia, close to the Saud regime. He sent them there. Bin Laden stayed until near the end of the war. And as I said, Brzezinski and the MI6 were actively arming and creating, that's the important word here, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, what became ISIS. So, two of the major groups who had significant numbers of people in Afghanistan were from Chechnya in the Russian Baltic republics and the Uyghurs from China. They'd been trained in Pakistan. This is where many of them were trained. This was Pakistan that was then ruled by the military dictator Zia al-Haq. He's the guy who ran a military coup and killed Bhutto, the former leader. Was a relatively sane leader of Pakistan, an elected leader. And the military person in charge of training was a guy named Musharraf, who later ran a military coup of his own and ran Pakistan for many years. So this was the Pakistan that was training these terrorists for the war in Afghanistan and, of course, for wars around the world. When that war ended, these people were all sent back to their countries, to Egypt, to Yemen, to Indonesia, the Philippines, Algeria, Libya, so on. And we had decades of war, of terrorist operations in all of these countries subsequent to this period. I won't go through all of that, but that led, obviously, to what we all know as 9/11, where George Bush, following 9/11, declared a war on terror, which I think you all know was not a war on terror, but in fact was a war on sovereign nationalist nation states, openly in league with the terrorist networks created by the British and the United States under the period when the U.S. was increasingly simply a subset of the British Empire. So that's the quick review of what I think is definitive proof of the British role in creating this Islamic terrorist operation. Now, what I want to do to conclude is to locate something that Hussein Askari, the head of our Swedish organization, who himself is a Iraqi Shia Muslim and a brilliant guy, pointed out to me last week, which was that to a very real extent, this Islamic terrorism operation has been defeated. It's not completely defeated, and the British aren't going to give up easily, I assure you, but it's been largely defeated by the collaboration between Russia, China, and President Trump. And this is extremely important to see this combination, which has succeeded in virtually defeating this entire British terrorist operation, along with India to some extent, but especially these Russia, China, and the United States. And there's two aspects to this. One is the way in which it was dealt with internally in countries, and secondly, the way it was dealt with through the Belt and Road operation. But let me first just say, internally, how was this dealt with? Well, in Russia, the Chechens had launched, or rather the Wahhabi Islamic layers within Chechnya had launched a revolt. They'd taken over Chechnya, and the neighboring Dagestan declared an independent republic. When Putin came to power in 1999 and 2000, he launched a very brutal war to destroy this Islamic fundamentalist destruction and mass terror that was taking place not only in their own area, but they had sent terrorists into Moscow. They were blowing up theaters and subway systems and so forth. So this was a very brutal war, but he succeeded in crushing this Saudi-infested jihadist takeover of these areas of the Russian area. He was attacked. He was called brutal, but it's very important to remember that the leaders of this had their headquarters where? In London, in Londonistan. So this was done there. In China, there were terrorist assaults coming from these Uyghurs trained in Pakistan, and many of whom had already been into the Middle East wars, who came back into China and between 1997 and 2014 carried out a series of brutal terrorist attacks, bombs, cars, actually even in Beijing, running cars into crowds, killing numbers, knife attacks, slashing dozens of people in train stations and so forth. So Xi Jinping at first thought that the dramatic economic development of Xinjiang would counter this kind of activity. He realized in 2014 that it was not, that these terrorist networks didn't give a damn about economic development or progress or collapse, and launched this project, which I described earlier. I won't go through it. They obviously imprisoned the actual terrorists, but they set up these educational camps where people were deterred for an average of about 8 months, given training, educated, given vocational training, and actually taught what real Islam was. And the incredible success of this, 3 years without any terrorist attacks, you have to ask yourself, what the hell does the West think they should have done about terrorism? What we did, go in and bomb countries back to the Stone Age? They didn't bomb anybody. They arrested and caught the terrorists, and they educated the rest of the population and have now succeeded in ending the terrorist threat within China. And you have to also mention that the entire British-U.S. war in Southwest Asia against Iraq and then Libya and then Syria was the next target, was stopped because Russia moved in. And when Russia moved in and said, we're not going to put up with another regime change, began working with the Syrian government legally because they'd been invited, unlike the foreign forces, including the U.S., who were not invited and therefore were breaking international law. But they succeeded in driving back ISIS. And when President Trump came to power, and this is very important, he openly declared we are not there for regime change. He had campaigned against these regime change wars. He said, we're there to defeat ISIS, and then we're going to leave. We're not there for regime change. He didn't like Assad. He said bad things about Assad. And he was sucked into some pinprick attacks by these fake chemical attacks, which were not really done by Assad at all, but were run by the British-run White Helmet. But by and large, he's lived up to that, and he's been trying like hell to get out of Syria, and his military won't let him at this point. The problem is that he doesn't really completely run the government, as we've seen. If we can defeat this coup attempt, he's going to be more liberated to do so, and that's our job. Then let me just mention that just last month, December 9th, the head of Xinjiang announced that these camps are closed. Everybody's graduated. So this is a tremendous victory. And there was CGTN ran a tour of the main camp in Kashgar, showing that, in fact, it was being shut down. So this is the way it was dealt with internally. But lastly, this is a point that Hussein made to me. The fact is that the Belt and Road really finished this operation off. The two countries that were most involved in creating this terrorist movement were Turkey and Pakistan. Pakistan run by the British and by the Saudi terrorists. China went into Pakistan with the biggest of the Belt and Road projects, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. And they've transformed that country and basically given them no reason to continue training terrorists. And in Turkey, which was working directly with the British and the CIA in taking the arms depots that had been left after the destruction of Libya, Gaddafi's arms depots were being transferred from Libya into Turkey and then into Syria to the terrorists. Turkey was completely involved in this process. I won't go through the details, but basically the Russians finally intervened, not only in Syria, but they intervened in Turkey and said, cut this crap out. And we'll help you develop your country. The Belt and Road will come in and help you develop your country, but you've got to cut it out. Now, they haven't completely cut it out. And in fact, they just announced the other day they're going to send troops to Libya, which would be a disaster. And we are counting on the U.S. and China and Russia together to stop that. But basically, they succeeded in undermining the effort to fund and arm the terrorists in Syria. So this is the way in which this has been done. It's been through a universal concept of how to bring about a new paradigm for the world based upon ending this British imperial design, both the terrorists and the other aspects of this, and to work together on development as the basis on which to create this new paradigm. So that's what I'll leave it with. Any kind of discussion, I'd be glad to pick up various aspects of this.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mike. By the way, can I be heard? Just had a little bit of a problem.
Yes.
Okay, very good. Great. So, and I want to thank you for, I think people will have many things to say in the Q&A. We're going to go right now to Barbara. I want to say something just in specific here. Question, as we said, we have inflection points in an arc. And we have a very specific situation that we've got to pursue in the United States, as we know. And I'm going to point out that it's got a musical principle of inversion. You invert what people think is happening to show them that the exact reverse is the case. For example, it ain't Russia. It's the people that's saying it's Russia. For example, the British. There is a foreign intervention, but it wasn't done by the Russians. There is not an impeachment legal procedure. There is a coup illegal procedure, which has been used in many countries before, and now it's being used in the United States. So the idea is to show people, but not merely that they're being bamboozled, but to give them the idea that there's a way to look at the world. And this is what we're providing. And specifically around this date, what has been a so-called day-to-day process in the United States, it's got a completely different meaning, and it's got a completely different way in which we can intervene. If we have confidence in what we are doing and how we proceed, not only is this able to be defeated, we actually may be able to turn this into perhaps the best organizing situation we've had in the United States in decades. So let me have Barbara go next, and then we'll go right after Barbara to Q&A. So Barbara, are you there?
I'm here.
All right.
I just want to bring this quickly into the present because last week The Economist in London began what is a opening flank for 2020 in terms of the effort by the same people Mike has been talking about. When we're talking about the British, what we're really talking about is that financial and private mercenary apparat, a terrorist apparat for hybrid warfare, which was actually set up with the collapse of the Bretton Woods system in 1971. And what began at that point was a huge alliance between the British Empire and the City of London and certain forces in the Middle East to actually set up what was then called the petrodollar regime, so to speak, but was also basically policed in a new form of empire by these types of religious terrorist mercenary armies, what LaRouche refers to in the movie Storm Over Asia, which she made, as being largely private armies controlled by financial interests to create a new form of world colonialism. And he put it very succinctly there, said, governed by these types of so-called small wars across the world, and particularly throughout Eurasia, which was considered by British politicians and geopoliticians to be the control point for all of world commerce throughout history, really. And their whole idea was whoever controls Eurasia actually controls the world. Now, obviously, Russia and China are located in Eurasia, if you're looking at your geography. And when LaRouche made Storm Over Asia, he very much concentrated on the idea that the next world war would come about most likely through two kinds of conditions. One is a financial calamity occurring and affecting most nations in the world, and the second was the constant pressing of key nations, Russia, China, India, literally up against the wall from the standpoint of keeping these nations down in a certain state of underdevelopment and keeping any nation in what was called the developing sector away from actual development. And to, throughout the entire period that Mike told you about, the key aim of the British geopolitical strategists was to take any nation state which really desired to be a nation state, to have a developing economy, and keep it in a modality of, perpetual warfare, because that way the British could actually control the world's financial system, because these other nations were not developing themselves. That's been the overall strategy for a very long time. Very few people know, for example, that because of how Americans think about these types of things and refuse to take long-term strategic viewpoints, that we actually got snookered into the start of our military decline, which was the Vietnam War, by none other than Ramsay MacDonald, operating on behalf of British interests from Singapore, who convinced a whole lot of U.S. generals that he, being a Brit who knew long-term strategy, was a hell of a lot smarter than they were, and suckered the United States essentially into the Vietnam War. So right now, what we're faced with the Economist declaration that what they see in the defeat of Trump is getting him involved in a war, you see this Middle East cockpit heating up again. Just this evening, the reports were coming over that, there was yet another attack of some sort on the Baghdad airport. The Iraqis and the Iranians are attributing it to us, and they said that the head of the Quds force for the nation of Iran was killed in that attack. And that's a very concerning development. The president obviously has said, we're doing some pinprick strikes here or what have you, but it's very clear if you read the British press that they are constantly pushing this idea that they need to succor us into a war. And, it's mostly using the remnants of this terrorist apparatus, which has been built up by them and unfortunately by us and by the very people who are leading the coup against Trump, as a way of how they think they can control the future of the world. We defeat this coup, and we defeat all of that to the extent that, a large part of the coup is an attempt to keep the president fighting on 50 different fronts and, to basically create a situation in which people do not take his power seriously in the world because they think other people are running things, And when you throw that into a volatile strategic situation, it becomes a very terrifying thing because people are making judgments as to whether they think the president or these crazy people are actually holding the levers of power. So that's what I wanted to throw into the strategic discussion, and I think, basically the history which Mike has provided should be fodder for everybody to actually ask a lot of questions about.
Okay, very good.
Q&A session has started. To ask your question, please press *6.
Open, so press *6. You may as well get in there now. Go ahead, Mike, and make your comment.
Yeah, what Barb just said tonight about Iran is very important because they're frantically trying to start a war with Iran. Trump himself has said we're not going to have a war with Iran. Same thing is going on with North Korea. The North Korean leadership had put the end of the year as sort of a deadline for some sort of concession from the U.S. that didn't come. So Kim Jong-un, in his year-end presentation to the Politburo, basically said we are no longer confined by the agreement to end denuclearization. We're going to create new weapons. But Trump responded immediately today and said, I trust Kim Jong-un. I think he's a man of his word. He said he's going to denuclearize, i.e. something is being discussed. You won't see that in the press. You might see them quote Trump, but by and large, they're playing everything they can to try to drag Trump into a war either with Iran or North Korea or virtually anybody. And of course, ultimately, they're trying to push a war with Russia and China. And this can and must be stopped, but it's going to have to be stopped by exposing the entire picture, not one little piece, the entire coup as simply part of this British geostrategic effort to defeat what is effectively a threat to the end of the British Empire once and for all, which is within our hands, the creation of an entirely new world paradigm. And it's a very, very dangerous time, but you have to keep in mind that this is a moment of tremendous potential because you have this unusual president, you have our forces capable of backing and moving this president in certain directions in collaboration with our work with Russia and China and others.
Okay, again, so people who don't know, get on. If you want to ask a question or make a comment, press *6 to get in the queue. We're going to go right to questions. We also have a couple of people texting, so we'll go to the first one now. Okay, are you able to hear us?
Hi, this is Randy in Washington State. How are you?
Okay, go right ahead.
Hi, Mike. You you mentioned that Trump was telling some of the generals to back off their actions in Syria, and you said he had no control over that. I was wondering if you could expound on that a little bit, since he is the commander-in-chief.
Yeah, he is the commander-in-chief. Yeah, exactly.
So we're listening to him.
I mean, that's exactly the point. I mean, look, Trump came in without a machine. He didn't have a political machine. He's never been in politics. He had to find some military people, some Wall Street people, somebody who could man his cabinet without really having any networks. He tried numerous people. He tried Flynn, who was a good choice. And Flynn was then destroyed because he was telling the truth about what Obama really had done in terms of fostering terrorism in order to achieve British regime change operations. He then tried the last Secretary of Defense, who turned out to turn around and tell Trump to go to hell when he said, get out of Syria. I mean, this is serious business. So he's tried numerous people. The press makes fun of him for having, a revolving cabinet. But the fact of the matter is that he has had to go through a number of people who all refuse to basically follow his instructions as the commander-in-chief, all of which is being done in the context of this massive, hysterical, criminal operation against him personally. We have in the current issue of our Executive Intelligence Review, what came out today, this really extraordinary letter that Trump wrote to Nancy Pelosi, which, if you haven't read it yet, make sure you get the current issue of EIR and read it. It's a long letter. It's 4 pages in our magazine. And he just reviews things that we've all discussed already. It's not news, but he's very, very clear that this is a coup against the United States. It's a direct attack on the American Constitution. He uses the word coup, and he says it's based upon a British intelligence officer. He says a foreign intelligence officer, i.e. Christopher Steele from MI6, hired by the Democrats to run a coup against the United States. He doesn't hold back. But this is the condition in which he is trying to run a country when he has an administration, his vice president, for instance, who gives raging attacks on China. Other members, Pompeo to some extent is under some control, but by and large issues raging attacks on Russia, on China. The so-called pro-Trump media network Fox, which runs hysterical attacks on China. And most of the reporters there equally hysterical attacks on Russia. Every effort he makes to end the British imperial divide between the East and the West, to bring about cooperation both in the war on terrorism and potentially on collaboration on economic development jointly through the Belt and Road and so forth, is completely opposed by virtually everybody in this country except most of the population. Although most of the population, only those who are associated with us, really have a sense of what the alternative is. But they know that something horrible is going on against the president. And because Trump connects with the population directly rather than through the media, through his mass rallies and through his Twitter account, he's able to maintain some semblance of reality with the American people. But in terms of how to correct this, bring about the kind of cultural exchange, which, for instance, understands why Think Like Beethoven is absolutely crucial if we're going to win this fight. We have to have a reform of the economic decay, which has been imposed through this green environmentalist insanity, through the outsourcing and the globalization process of our economy. We have to restore science, as Trump has begun to do with the space program. But we absolutely must also have a true cultural renaissance, which restores classical culture, a culture which appeals to the human mind rather than as LaRouche used to say, a culture which appeals above the belt instead of below the belt, like the degrading culture we have today. So this Trump doesn't have in his hands. He has the potential. We have the capacity to create this kind of national movement through our committees of correspondence, through our fight for culture, through our choruses around the country, and through this exposure of the coup, which Barbara's been crucial in pulling together, along with our friends from the former intelligence community, like Benny and Larry Sherman, so forth. So this is a situation in which you can't say, why doesn't Trump do this? Why does he hire a Bolton and then have to fire him? This is something where he has nobody but us, really. And, of course, Roger Stone, who was somebody who admired LaRouche as the greatest mind of the 20th century, that's why he's under attack. That's why he's been silenced to a certain extent, because he was getting these messages to Trump. But this is something that each and every one of us in this moment of really historical transformation, one way or the other, it just calls out to each one of us to recognize that in these moments of crisis, it's what we do, which is going to determine, each and every one of us, what we do is going to determine the outcome of what can be a tremendous transformation into a new renaissance and a new paradigm for mankind, or it could end up in nuclear war. So the truth is sitting in our hands and before us, and it's really up to us to take that responsibility.
I'm going to move on to the next question just because we have a lot of people in the queue. I know Barbara may have something to say as well, so let's see what we got in the next question. Yes, can you hear us?
I can, and you can hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, great. This is Jay from upstate. The man was just talking about generals who were disobeying Trump's commands in, I think, Syria. Now, I'm, a little confused. Why do we never hear of these generals being court-martialed for disobeying direct orders from the commander-in-chief?
It's like I said, it's Trump doesn't have the power to look. Read the letter that Trump wrote to Pelosi. He said, "You have just broken every constitutional rule that this nation has been built upon. Why aren't these people already in jail?" Now, potentially they will, because Trump has he's appointed Barr to be his attorney general, who's hired Durham, who is, by all indications, carrying out an extremely serious investigation of the actual crimes of the intelligence community from the Obama administration, and some who are still hanging around. So the question of why these people are not being given their due rewards, so to speak, is that we are under siege by the British, by the media that's controlled by the British, by an absolutely corrupt Congress, not just the Democrats, who are obviously totally corrupt, but many, many Republicans. As Barbara might want to speak on this, she's looking right now into the whole question of whether or not the enemy is going to succeed in trying to drag some Republicans out from under supporting Trump, because many of them, Trump was never really a Republican. You know, he ran his campaign in open opposition to the whole Bush Klan, which had by and large run the Republican Party for the last 20 years, and against many other neocons, openly opposed. So he has used the Republican Party quite wisely to keep himself in power, given that he had no other real base of support except ourselves, and his direct communication with the American population, and saying that he was going to overthrow this whole anti-growth, anti-development, pro-war insanity, which has destroyed this country over the last 20, 30 years. But, you know, this is something which you can't say, why doesn't Trump do this and that? It's up to us to make sure that what we've done already and what we have to do in the future succeeds in successfully destroying this coup attempt and the effort to bring us into a new war.
Barbara, you have something?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Let me just tell you what I think here. I mean, the problem that people keep getting into is this idea that, you know, we're sort of out there, we see an event, and it's our job to essentially comment on it in a certain way and say, why doesn't he do this, or why doesn't he do that, or what's wrong with him, how come I know that this procedure would work or that procedure would work. And what it really fails to take into account is you have to put yourself momentarily in the mindset of being the President of the United States and thinking a little bit in the long term, and recognizing that what you've got around you in Washington, D.C., not in the rest of the country, okay? We're primarily talking about a bunch of people in the bowels of Wall Street in New York City, and we're talking about a bunch of people right here in Washington, D.C., who have, however, a long-standing control over the levers of political power. And that kind of disease infects the Congress, and it, you know, most clearly has created a national news media which is running a full-scale, 24-hour-a-day propaganda operation aimed at your head so that you can't think clearly, and you end up actually thinking, well, I see this event which has now been reported, and you're telling me about X, and really what I'm going to do is comment on how come this doesn't happen, and I can't figure out why it doesn't happen. Well, the primary reason why it doesn't happen is because of that mode of thinking by us, okay? It's not by what the president is doing. It's by not rising ourselves up to the level of actually thinking through and thinking on the level of what Lyndon LaRouche would characterize as grand strategy. And so you have a tendency when you get into this kind of warfare to, you know, kind of, people get fearful, so they basically say, I'm going to run ahead and jump ahead, and if I get shot, I get shot. They just don't think the thing through clearly. And part of what we're trying to do here is we're saying, in the midst of all these things which appear to be very scary and out of control, really what you're seeing is something which is quite different than what anybody has seen in this country for years, which is a full exposure of that apparatus which has screwed up the country royally. And they're not all powerful. When we're talking about a problem of how these people have conducted themselves or what's gone wrong, The problem is that a lot of them are very, very stupid. And that's to our advantage. It's not to the advantage of the country, most certainly, but it's to our advantage in fighting this thing. You have to realize that people who would do the types of things which our military has done over the past 30 years are fundamentally, as LaRouche would call them, simply incompetent at a certain level. They're not all powerful, they're just incompetent. So the question which was raised at the beginning of this call, think like Beethoven, think outside the box, think creatively, school your mind so that you can actually rise to the level that has to come from the citizens right now in this fight. Trump wins if you do that. But if we continue to sit back and expect him to essentially do everything, and act according to what our impulse says he should do at this particular point without having the slightest damn idea of what his terrain is and what he's actually thinking about and what he knows, a great bunch of which is stuff that's classified, that's staring him in the face on a day-to-day basis, we're not going to get anywhere in this battle. To the extent that you guys actually, say, okay, I'm going to take personal responsibility for changing the world here, then, we actually get somewhere, because a small cadre of citizens acting in that way is exactly how the American Revolution was made, and it's exactly how people change things despite apparently small forces in all of human history. So that's how I'd respond to that. I could come up with 55 things on any given day about why didn't he do X and why didn't he do Y and what's going on with that, all right? But,
I very much do appreciate your insights here. Truly.
Okay.
Yes, he's under siege. There's no guns, but he's under siege.
Right. You got it. And it's up to us to break it, okay, which we can do.
Okay, thanks a lot for the question. There's a lot of the people. Thank you. And I think it's a good, thank you very much for bringing that up. Okay, are you able to hear us?
Hello, good evening. Yeah, my name's Ted Turner, and I'm on the West Coast with the San Francisco LaRouche PAC group. I've been coming for the last couple of years to some meetings. And what I'm hearing in your presentation, my thinking would be to, seriously consider sending the body of your presentation to as many in the Senate, even to the President's office, to those that could hear what you stated tonight. It's a clear statement of the direction that they're heading, and that they've been fighting the battle in these last years, and that I think they'll be strongly uplifted and encouraged to continue the battle and make decisions to take a firm stand, and with maybe some final words that you presenters have to strengthen that, to take action, and that you have this large group of people that the LaRouche group represents in the country who are determined for good to come on the planet. And I strongly agree with everything that you stated in regards to China, Russia, our government with the President Trump, and everything that LaRouche has stood for. It's a beautiful thing, and that would be what I would like to say.
Oh, I wish it were the case that we could just send this to the Senate and they'd suddenly wake up, but that's not going to happen. But what we do have is these committees of correspondence, like yourself and others around the country, hundreds of people. And I think there's probably people from probably hundreds of cities on this call right now. And all of these congressmen and all of these senators come back to their home state, and they get messages from their constituents. And to the extent to which we organize that fight, and as I'm sure you know, we've been intervening in the town meetings every chance we get, simply bringing a sense of reality and finding, as we have in our field organizing, which some of you know, some of you might not, we're probably the only organization in America for many, many, many years who actually simply goes out into the public and sets up a table with our signs in front of a post office or something and have contact with the American people directly. The only exception to that, besides ourselves, is President Trump. And he can't go out in the street and talk. But as you know, he has these massive, massive rallies with 30, 40, 50,000 people and thousands more outside every time. And his tweets every single day. He has overcome the fact that our media and our Congress are controlled almost entirely by our enemies, by the enemies of our Constitution, by the enemies of the American Republic, by the British Empire. And he's managed to a great extent, get around that through this direct connection with the population. And it's our influence over that population which is the key to succeeding in what Barbara was referring to, which is that each and every one of us, at a moment of crisis like this, our powers are vastly expanded. In normal circumstances, people don't want to hear from people like us. Lynn used to talk about the ones and twos back 30, 40 years ago. He'd say, look, don't worry about the fact that people aren't going to hear what we're saying. They're not going to want to hear about it. They're going to assume that the powers that be are going to take care of us. They will not allow disaster to happen to America. And when we tell them that that disaster is coming and they have to act, they're not going to listen. But there's going to be one or two people here and there who will listen. And those are the people who made up our organization, a very small organization, really. You know, you can measure our core membership in a few hundred, and our networks in a few, perhaps tens of thousands at most. But this is small. This is tiny. But the power of ideas far exceeds numbers. Lynn used to say, don't worry about gate receipts. You know, people like the Communist Party, they say, look, we have to get people to come to our meetings, so we're going to talk about baseball. My introduction to our concert on New Year's Day yesterday was, we hold these classical cultural events to give you some respite from football. This was the gate receipts idea of other organizations, which Lynn said, no, we have to think like Gideon's army. If somebody's not committed to waging this fight, including potentially giving your life, like any great soldier, if you're not willing to fight for that, then we don't want you here. But we need those people who recognize that there is no future for themselves or for their family or for their nation if they aren't willing to put their lives on the line and to expand their own creative powers, which is required of most people who've been, subjugated to this kind of degrading culture for the last 30, 40, 50 years and longer, actually, and act. Now, on the other hand, as I'm sure you know if you've been out organizing with us, there is a dramatic cultural phase shift going on in the population. There's no question in most people's minds that this country is in the process, has been destroyed, and is in a crisis moment. So what we find where we go amongst the Trump base, which has a lot of problems, like the China problem, for instance, but also many of what used to be called the Reagan Democrats, which are now the Trump Democrats, the Democratic working people who turned away from the Democratic Party when, as Reagan said, actually, it wasn't that I turned away from the Democratic Party turned away from me. And that's exactly what's happened now, where you have a Democratic Party which is in no way connected to the base of working people, the collaboration between labor unions and the nation in building our great cities under Roosevelt and so forth, and building the arsenal of democracy that saved us from fascism, for that matter. But that's not what the party is anymore. It's now turned to what they call, personal policy and identity politics, gay rights, women's rights, black rights, blue rights, pink rights, everything but the interest of the nation. Anything that can divide us is their policy. And on the other side, you have this neocon insanity on the Republican side, which Trump has taken over. He's basically crushed it by his campaign against the neocons and the Bush family and so forth. So you have a dramatic shift going on out there, which, again, it could turn into nothing. It's up to us to be responsible on a local level and acting on a national, in fact, an international level, on the local level, to bring the overview, that the idea of a global shift in the world to each and every human being that we meet wherever we are. It's entirely up to the way we act. As Barbara located, this is not a question of why doesn't somebody do something. It's what can I do now at this moment of the greatest crisis in American history? And it is. Helga the other day said, look, this is a moment in which you have to go back basically to the collapse of the Roman Empire to find a moment of crisis as severe as we're facing today. The potential of actually ending the era of empire altogether and bringing about for the first time in all of history a truly global renaissance, not a Western renaissance or a Muslim renaissance or a Confucian renaissance, but a truly global renaissance in which people recognize that we are all human beings, that we're distinguished from the animals by the fact that we have these creative powers brought to us by the Creator, and which we have to recognize that the common aims of mankind is the basis on which we can advance humanity and expand into space and bring dominion over not only over the nature, but over the universe. This is our task. This is the glorious future which we have a potential to shape today for generations beyond our own death, and which is a time in which we have to treasure this potential great moment in history.
You know,
Excuse me, just have to say the following. We have several other people on the call. Go ahead and make the point you want to make, sir. But
I appreciate that very much. Thank you. My statement again is that you have just made a grand, clear statement of the process and of what you are communicating. And I would say this again: get this into the hands of people who can hear it, that would take it to their higher ups in the Senate, so that they hear that the LaRouche group is doing this right now, today, in response for what you just stated, for the positive outcome for the world. And we need that, and you have, it's been stated perfectly right here. And I'm just going to leave you with that. So okay. I appreciate you guys, and thank you so much. Listen, brother, I'm telling you right now,
I know you will.
Take action. You have the ability to do the action. I don't. I can say some hello to this.
No, I don't agree. I don't agree.
No.
You do.
Well, let's not quibble about that. Listen to what I've said. Listen to what I've said.
Yeah.
I'll say good night. Good night.
We'll take that out.
Okay, good night.
Good night.
Yeah, you're able to hear us.
Good evening. This is Jim calling in from Michigan. A couple of comments and a question. Susan Bowen had sent me a link to the Fidelio that was put out in 1950 that John Segerson had sent to her. And I would like to say, if you haven't already done it, I'd say post that link that John Segerson came up for that particular Fidelio performance on the website and put it in your daily alerts. So it's very rich and clear. It's the best I've heard. And so maybe you could put that out in the daily alert and on the website. Now,
yeah, I agree with you 100%. I actually proposed that we put out a message tonight with the two versions that John suggested, and one which I came across earlier with Krista Lidzig singing from Berlin in 1953, I think it was. Those three are wonderful, and everybody really deserves the joy of sitting through watching one of those performances. So I agree with you on that.
Yeah, hi. Can I be heard?
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Hello, Mike. This is Alvin here in New York.
Hey, Alvin.
I wanted to go back in the discussion the dialogue you began, going back to the internment issue, the issue of internment, and how the Chinese government responded to this always orchestrated British terror operation that you outlined in its international effect. You had mentioned this but just mentioned it in a class you gave a couple of weeks ago to us. And you gave a lot more insight and detail as to what the actual operation was, its length of time, and what was done there. And it's just an amazing thing to me. I was extremely struck by it, on how government can respond, or leadership can respond to a crisis. FDR responded to the crisis by the CCC. That was what was required. Here you have something similar in that it's a crisis, and but the idea of education, of training, of actual religious faith without the insanity of the extremism to be brought forth, where a stay was 8 months. I'm still very struck by that. We hear nothing about this until you said what you said. I knew nothing about this. And when you say internment camps, that automatically, in my mind, puts a sense of, oh my gosh, and all kinds of images go through your mind of what that can mean through Hollywood and of course, the press. But what you're describing is something completely different, also quite sanitary and healthy. And of course, in our country now, we need, and Lynn had called for, a type of CCC for the young people, something on a much larger scale, where you get the kids out of the disease, which is where they live, and establish something in another part of the country, which would, of course, require massive infrastructure. My question to you is there anything you can provide us with? I'd like to learn and know more about this, the sources and so on, because I think it's a very powerful alternative for new people in the United States that see the condition and then can see how a crisis can be actually dealt with, whether it's economic, cultural, or even in terrorism. So could we put something together to learn more about this?
There'll be something in the briefing tomorrow and in the alert on Monday, which won't be extensive, but it'll be on what I just described of what's going on in the internment camps. But I think what you just brought up about a comparison with the FDR CCC camps is very interesting. I hadn't really thought of it that way, but you're absolutely right. This was not enforced internment in those days. This was basically Roosevelt creating a situation where we had a vast infrastructure deficit and you had vast unemployment. And he simply said, look, folks, I'll put you to work, we'll pay you, but here's the job that has to be done. And people were delighted to join the fight. To join the jobs, to become part of these vast CCC camps, which build roads, which build institutions, built dams. They did all kinds of things all over the country. And our situation today is just as bad. I have a horrendous deficit in our infrastructure. We have vast needs for labor, which in many cases, when you look at the destruction of the poor youth of our nation, not just the minorities, but virtually everybody, from the destruction of our economy over the last 50 years, 40 years, these are people who have no skills. They've been, many cases, turned to drugs. They've been street people and various kinds of degraded lives. It's not going to be easy to give them the skills, but they're willing. Of course, people, if they're offered in a positive way, a sense of not only having a job, but also learning some skills and having a future, then we have every reason to think that we can indeed repeat something like the CCT camps from the Roosevelt era. And the fact that we called them camps and we call the Xinjiang facilities camps, it's not a degrading term. It's not concentration camps, as idiots like Cruz and Rubio say, and even Pompeo, concentration camps like Nazi Germany. This is insane. And especially since they're now all closed down. But, the fact is that they have jobs to go to after these camps in Xinjiang because China is still growing. China just announced over the Christmas weekend, China opened 3 new high-speed rail lines. totaling approximately 1,000 kilometers in 3 different locations, some of them connecting Beijing with the areas to the north where the Winter Olympics are going to be held in 2022. But then they announced yesterday that during this coming year of 2020, the same year in which China will be eliminating poverty, extreme poverty in their country, they've already reduced somewhere in the range of 750 to 800 million people from extreme poverty. And the most difficult cases are still remaining, but they're absolutely committed by doing it by the end of 2020. And during this year, they are opening 20 new high-speed rail lines, which is just extraordinary. They're going to be increasing their total length of high-speed rail from about 35,000 kilometers now. I'm not sure where it's going to head up after these 20 new lines. But this is going on in the midst of a global economic downturn. And yet, this is what they're achieving. It's truly extraordinary. I heard a joke when I was up there in New York where I saw you, Alvin, where somebody said, you know, why doesn't America have any high-speed rail? We don't have a single mile of high-speed rail in America. You know why? Yeah, the Chinese stole it. When we weren't looking, they came and stole all our high-speed rail. I mean, this is classic stupidity. The other joke was the guy who comes up and says, you know, I really appreciate you LaRouche people, and I support Trump, but why in the hell do you support China? It's a vicious dictatorship. There's no freedom there. And the response is, yeah, you're right. It's a vicious dictatorship. Why? You know, in China, they make their children do their homework. That's just dictatorship. You know, we have to bring freedom to that. Why? They can't even smoke marijuana. And there's no pornography on their internet. There's no freedom there. We have to bring freedom to China. So, I mean, you have to use a little bit of humor to deal with this insanity. You know, they just had these international results of where they test students and children where they stand on reading and science and mathematics. And the U.S. was around the middle in all three, and China's number one in all three. This is a dictatorship. What are they? They're whipping people to become brilliant. I mean, this is a culture very different from ours, but one which, ironically, economically, is closer to the American system of economics in terms of the government doing what Alexander Hamilton called for, which is to have the government direct credit into industry, agriculture, infrastructure, so that the private sector doesn't have to worry about having enough energy and enough clean water and educated people to work for them. That was the government job under the American system, unlike the British free market, free trade system. So who's practicing the American system today? It's by far more being practiced in China than it is here in the United States. That's the irony. And yet, I think what you said, what Roosevelt represented, was that idea that the government can and must use its powers in a period of crisis to actually address the needs of the population, the general interest of the people, which is what our Constitution and our Declaration of Independence called for.
Okay, very good. This is a question for Barbara. It comes from Erica from Alabama. She's asking about Bloomberg. The basic question is that, they're talking about $400 million being spent by Bloomberg on ads and so on for the presidency. And she's asking, how concerned do we have to be about his presidential bid? What is this really about? And what is its relationship in terms of the whole British intelligence side of things we've been talking about so far?
Well, Bloomberg is a British intelligence asset, lock, stock, and barrel. There's no question about it. He maintains a residence in the city of London. He's a knight of the British Empire. So if you're asking that question, that's pretty clear. He is also the key guy in terms of relationship to Mark Carney. He and Mark Carney just switched places in terms of being the global representative for enforcing the Green New Deal hysteria globalist policy throughout the world. So that's who he represents. I don't think that, from the standpoint of a candidacy, he has a lot of baggage, which will soon start to be exploited naturally by the Trump folks. We happen to have a very particular view of him because we've been following him, and LaRouche has been following him way back when he first ran for mayor of New York City. What he represents is simply, as one wag put it, a hologram. In other words, he's a visual image. He's what money buys, and there's not really a person. He's like a ventriloquist dummy. There's not really a person behind that mask. The person behind the mask, I said last week, is someone who you can document is so sexually immature that he can't stop making lewd comments about women every time he's in the presence of one, which results in a whole guard being put around him to prevent him from actually being very close to very many people at any given time. He's just a completely crazed 5'7" male whose mind is somewhere in the neighborhood of being that of a 21-year-old when it comes to the opposite sex. So, is his candidacy going anywhere? His primary thing is going to be to get in there and to run massive waves, which is what he's doing now, of negative publicity about Donald Trump and making claims that, as mayor of New York City, he accomplished many things in pre-profiled critical areas. And this is where you do have to worry to a certain extent, because what it's all based on is having a massive data dump, which they've purchased from people's social media habits, from big data, etc., and running, a artificial intelligence profiling operation on everybody in the Trump base to see whether or not they can get them disoriented by this ad campaign, which is huge. And it's a test of how far propaganda can actually be utilized as a total warfare operation against the president, which is what it is. That said, all right, you come up against the limits of this type of stuff. Hillary Clinton had a similar big data operation which told her not to go to Michigan and Wisconsin the last time around. And they called it Ada, the failed machine. And you could basically say that that's why she lost the election, is because she relied upon artificial intelligence to such an extent that she completely lost touch with what was going on out there with the population. So it's concerning. I think we have to really go after it, which we're going to do over the next couple of weeks in EIR and on the website. But it's not something that I think we have to be completely freaked out about or anything like that. It's a huge amount of money. People resent that. It's very clear that the argument which is going to be made in a normal political sense is he's trying to simply buy the presidency, and he doesn't deserve it, and his policies stink. But, what's essentially being done here, is something we have to take a good look at, because it could very well be a cover for, a couple of other things, which you can think of readily once you realize that much money is being spent, and how it's being spent in the sort of Silicon Valley morass, which is something we've constantly stressed we have to be very observant about coming into the election. So that's what I would say about that. Just getting back to the discussion of CCCs and other things, what I think is particularly useful in terms of the United States, and what we need here is not so much a comparison with other countries. What we really need here to instill in people is really a sense of national mission once again. It's something we've stressed. It's something I know Keisha Rogers is working on around the space program. It's making, an actual, programmatic thrust with the Artemis program, and the whole idea that you're really constructing a revived massive university, on wheels, so to speak, with the space program. And, getting the president to actually be bold enough to go out there and to make the same type of call which President Kennedy made, and saying, we're going to do this, and it's going to reshape the entirety of everything we're doing, including our education system, which really needs a top-to-bottom redirection in terms of going towards fundamental science and classical culture. So, I think that's also sort of a thought that I'd like to throw in there.
Okay, very good. We'll go to the next person on the line. Okay, are you able to hear us?
Hi, this is Ann. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, I just wanted to, there's probably a lot of new people on the call tonight. And for those of you who are unaware, the new people, the person that the senator has never heard from is going to have a huge impact on that senator. I mean, you've got the power. You've got more power than you have any idea about. I just wanted to say that.
Okay.
Good.
Okay, well, good. I think we all appreciate that. Thank you. Okay, are you able to hear us?
Good evening. This is Lee from Utah. I missed the name of who gave that first presentation tonight, and that is in response to the one or two that have asked about these kinds of things. And is it going to be published? Is there something like this going into publication at this point?
Yeah, my name's Mike Billington. I'm
it's Mike. Okay.
American Intelligence Review. Yeah, we're going to either transcribe this or put something together which conveys. This is something that Helga had asked for, actually, that we go back to the Bernard Lewis plan, the British plan for creating these Islamic radical movements around the world to undermine Russia and China. So we'll put together something probably for the next issue of EIR that's based on this presentation.
Well, it was excellent because it points out the positive that was going on in China and in Russia. See, I just watched a video tonight before getting on the call about all the vacant cities in China. And so you see all these failed policies of the communists, and to hear about the positive policies that they're able to bring a change is 650 million people lifted out of poverty, and now all this transportation system, and what has happened with the Muslims, instead of trying to kill them all. That's the picture that most people have of China, is that it's all the negative.
Imagine trying to get away with that in America after we had given in to this British imperial war policy, which killed literally tens of thousands, perhaps millions of Muslims, most of them not fighters, just innocent civilians, millions driven out of their homes into being refugees in refugee camps all over the world, millions of them risking their lives crossing the Mediterranean to get to Europe, undermining the European countries with this vast migration. All of this caused by Bush launching the Iraq War and Obama following it up. And we have the gall to think Americans are going to be so stupid as to think that what China is doing to combat terrorism is an evil affront to human rights. But let me mention,
and Russia,
brought it up.
Russia too.
Yeah, the same thing. Russia, the evil
same
empire.
Thing.
There's a reason that 90% of the Russian people support Vladimir Putin. There's lots of problems in Russia, but they know that he is standing up for their national interest and their national dignity. But just briefly, I've seen many of these stories about the vast vacant cities. That wasn't created under the communist regime. It was created because when the Chinese opened up completely, they maintained certain controls. They still have a Glass-Steagall type policy that they allow the investment banks in, but they won't let them take over their commercial banks. They direct their credit. But they did unleash a certain amount of open freedom in communities and provinces investing, and people got into a housing bubble. There were whole communities created of huge apartment buildings, which all of a sudden they couldn't fill. And so there were many videos made about, the empty cities in China. This is a disaster. Well, there's two things to say about that. One is that they don't have mortgage-backed security in China. So while the investors in these big projects did lose money, and some of them went bankrupt, it didn't cause a breakdown of the entire economy the way the mortgage-backed securities bubble in 2008 nearly brought down the entire Western financial system. It was just the bankruptcy of those people who invested. Secondly, the state has an interest in those cities, and while they were empty for a long time, they're still viable living conditions. And since the time, you probably were watching videos from 4 or 5 years ago, since that time, most of those villages have actually been occupied because they basically were under the direction of the government. So that's the situation.
Okay.
I thought that the Salt Lake Tribune article was very interesting here a while back, talking about the difference between communists and China and the United States. And one of the comments that was made in that article was that there's more communist America than there is in China, because they
I don't know about that. But the Chinese call it socialism with Chinese characteristics. What they mean by that is that under Xi Jinping especially, but really since Deng Xiaoping began the reform in the late 70s and 80s, they basically restored the Confucian tradition. This is Chinese classical culture. And while they maintain a certain socialist structure, meaning that they have a single party rather than warring parties, they have a meritocracy system where if you want to be a political leader, you have to prove yourself at the local level and then at the provincial level, and ultimately you have to prove that you're competent. And they have a method of basically testing you both by actual educational testing, but also by your experience, by showing that you deserve to become a leader. And that meritocracy system, which Benjamin Franklin, by the way, greatly admired in the Confucian system, is still in various forms used today. And as a result, they're able to achieve things that we used to be able to achieve here in America when we believed that the government had the right to guarantee certain things, guarantee that people had access to health, guarantee that there was adequate energy and transportation and clean water to the population. We used to have that as the American system. It's been given up. We've been told, no, leave that to the market, leave that to the private sector. Well, the result, of course, is the complete collapse of our infrastructure, the collapse of our education, the collapse of our health system. And we have to return to the American system.
Okay, very good. I'm going to go to the next person. Let me also say we've got about 10 minutes left, everybody, so we're going to try to get through these questions. All right, go ahead. Can you hear us?
Hey, Mike. Yes, I can hear you, Mike. This is Faz from Michigan. So I missed the first part of this. I apologize if you covered this earlier. To what extent is any of this true? In terms of, to your knowledge, in terms of the camps that have been set up, people are concerned that are of the Muslim faith that the Muslims there are being made to renounce their religion, eat things like pork that are against religion.
I did go through it. I went through it.
You did that, right?
I went through it in some length. Yeah, the camps have actually been closed. I described this earlier. The education process has been successful. They have never been denied their religion. They've been denied the Wahhabi pro-terrorist lunacy, which they were being peddled by some of the madrasas set up by the Saudis and others in Pakistan and even within China. But no, it's completely false, and in fact, they've been closed because they've succeeded in doing what they intended to do. It's all lies. It's lies like Saddam has weapons of mass destruction. It's at that level, perhaps even worse in the sense that they're trying to provoke a war with China, not with Iraq.
How can one argue this? How could this be documented?
It might be good, Foz, for you to listen to the beginning of the call because that's what Mike did in his presentation.
Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah,
Very good. I will do that.
And we will
Excellent.
transcribe this and get it out so you can get it.
Okay,
Okay.
great. Okay, hi. Are you able to hear us?
Oh, yes, I can hear you. This is Darwin. I'm calling from St. Louis, Missouri, Illinois.
Okay.
Hi. Oh, and, I know we don't have a lot of time, so I'm just going to get right down to my question. Now, with the British-run terrorism and the Ukraine gate and the Russia gate, between Russia and China, their technology is somewhat superior to ours. What would be America's options if we can't create a four-power agreement between the four powers, which I feel that is very much needed because we do have an edge in the space race?
Well, China's not ahead of us exactly in technology. There's many, many areas where the U.S. still has far superior technological capacities, but it's clear that the Chinese have caught up in some areas and have gone ahead in others, like the whole 5G operation with Huawei. And, you know, the Trump administration was snookered into this vicious attack on Huawei, which Trump has tried to counter. He has said several times, we're not going to use suppression of their technology. We're going to develop ours to be better than them. Well, all power to you. That's exactly the right way to respond. But that's, of course, not what's being done. We arrested one of their executives up in Canada. We've imposed sanctions. Trump's tried to counter that. On the space program, they were the first to land on the far side of the moon and so forth. There is no way that we're going to succeed even in what Trump himself has set as our goals for going to the moon and going to Mars. And then beyond that, without international cooperation. Trump knows this. He may not be able to say it quite that way, and you have these insane laws that were imposed by crazy people like Congressman Wolf from here in Virginia, that it's illegal to collaborate with China on certain space-based things because they'll steal our technology. Well, we're at a point where we need to, quote, steal, end quote, some of their technology, i.e. cooperate on many of these areas. Most importantly, I would say immediately, the most immediate task is for the U.S. to join in the new Silk Road, which is denounced as an imperialist plot, a debt trap, and all these crazy things. We need to join with them, as Japan has, by the way. Japan is co-investing with China in Thailand rail development, and they're looking at African investments. This is exactly what we need to do. We need China to invest in our infrastructure. We need to create the Hamiltonian National Bank, an infrastructure bank, which the Chinese would be absolutely delighted to swap their $1 trillion in U.S. debt holdings, which pay them virtually zero interest and which they're not allowed to use to invest in infrastructure in the U.S. because this crazy Congress and the laws of our country prevent them from building certain infrastructure, which they say is a danger to us. They're even stopping the Chinese from building subway cars because they say they're going to drive by the Pentagon and steal our secrets through secret technology in the subway cars. This is the level of insanity. And yet, if they were to swap that money for investments in a national bank, a Hamiltonian national bank, they would be delighted to earn 2% interest, and the money would then be used to invest in American infrastructure, which is what they want to do, because they have a win-win view of the world. If there's cooperation with the U.S., they know that this is going to benefit the U.S., it's going to benefit China, it's going to benefit the world. And in fact, there was a very interesting op-ed in the Global Times, their English language newspaper from the Communist Party today, which said the elite in the U.S. has been governing their China policy, which is becoming extremely dangerous. They obviously are distinguishing from Trump. And we can't support that. We have to help stop it. But more important, we can't react. We can't allow a hard-line response. We have to keep opening up, including to the U.S. And in fact, just the other day, not part of the trade deal, they lifted or lowered tariffs on a huge, I think it was 800 some different U.S. products, not part of the trade deal, just because they are continually trying to open up and as carefully, because they can't allow some sort of a, free market, free trade destruction of their American system, actually, somewhat American system policy of government oversight. But they are trying to open up as much as possible, and they are not going to allow themselves and the right wing, or you might say, or the conservative forces there to react to these anti-China hysteria in the United States. I think we have played a significant role, Helga personally, through her many trips to China, in conveying to the Chinese, don't succumb to this McCarthyite anti-China hysteria. Keep in mind that Trump is an unusual figure who wants to be friends with China, who constantly repeats that Xi Jinping is a great leader of a great nation, but that we have to have sovereignty here and we have to have sovereignty there. And our former leaders gave up our sovereignty to this globalization, to the WTO policies and the free market. Look for the cheapest production instead of the most productive investments. And that policy has to be reversed. We have to go back to a policy of emphasizing creative and technological development, which increases the productivity of our entire nation and, in fact, of the entire world. And if we do that in collaboration with Russia and with China and with everybody else, then everybody wins.
Barbara, I'd like to ask you if you have anything to say about this, since he asked. Yeah.
I think that, I revert to what LaRouche had to say in The Coming Eurasian World, and what he talked about there is the absolute necessity of the United States becoming once again a full-set economy. And you have to basically take a look at where we are right now, which is that we have allowed the higher technological platforms in our country to deteriorate drastically in terms of modern manufacturing capacities, other things like that. Irrespective of what happens in terms of trade flows, we have to basically make sure that we are bringing this country back into a full-set industrial economy. And that, I think, is most rapidly accomplished through what Lynn talked about in his 4 laws, and what he talked about, the 2 laws having to do with ending the vulnerability to financial collapse by having Glass-Steagall and by actually having directed credit flows into a national bank, and by creating the types of programs which actually create high wages, the capacity for family formation, a healthcare system that works not through, single payer or any simple program, but through reviving the entirety of the economy in depth, and by going full scale into fusion power development and into exploring space on that basis. If we do that, what he talked about is every sovereign nation in the world has to have a full-set economy and has to develop itself to its fullest extent. And the only way that becomes possible within the framework of the current financial situation is by getting together with China, Russia, India, and other countries and deliberating on a new financial system with fixed long-term credit being available for development throughout the world. And by, at the same time as we're developing this country back to a full-set economy and developing thousands of jobs, part of the mission that actually accomplishes that is going out into the world and ensuring the development of the other countries in joint projects. So, I think that the approach here, has to persistently be the one that the president has taken to a limited extent, which is we've got a mess here, all right? And we can't just basically say, okay, now, everything is solved if we actually have a 4-power agreement right now. It's not solved by the 4-power agreement. The 4 powers are actually going to the type of higher platform or higher cultural level between cultures, which is on the end of basic science and basic huge breakthroughs in our understanding of the laws of the universe. And what Lynn says comes out of that is not some global-only sort of regime. It's an actual higher culture than the culture of the nations that are participating in that exploration at the boundaries of what we presently know about the laws of the universe. So, I think it's important to stress that particular perspective, because the difficulty I have with actually thinking about it always in terms of simply the four powers, and we should have better relationships with Russia and China, and there's a vast potential there to develop the world, that's fine. But if the United States continues in relative decline, you can almost assure yourself that you're going to have a war. And the way out, obviously, is through a dual set of programs. We bring our nation back up to snuff at the same time as we collaborate with other nations on the common interests of mankind. And I think that's kind of the simple way that I would approach it.
Okay, we want to thank the last questioner for what he had to say. So we're at the end of our time. We've pretty much gotten, in one sense, a form of summary statement from both of you. I'd just like to say that on this thing that Barbara just raised, the important conception, I think, is one that Lynn talked about, the increase of the potential relative population density of a nation and of economies, which is a thing that's being constantly attacked either through forms like the Green New Deal or through other peculiar ideas that are out there. But if you look at the United States and you look at the need not merely to put people back to work or something general like that, but the need to overhaul the entire thinking of the nation for the purpose of resurrecting the labor process and an advanced labor process in the United States, it's going to be very important for us to think in terms of shocking people into that new world. 4 nations announced that they are going to be going to Mars this year in various forms of missions. The United States has the most advanced space program in the world. The president has made it very clear what his view and orientation is in terms of both that program and also in terms of the idea of working with various nations on the frontiers, not merely of space or something, but the frontiers of science and technology. At the same time, where's the citizens movement to make that happen? And I think that is that's where the buck stops, and that's where we are tonight. I just wanted to, therefore, let me just give now the opportunity for. Why don't we do Mike, you first, and then Barbara for summary statements?
Oh, let me just say, let's make this a great new year. This is maybe our last opportunity, but this is a great opportunity. We should be totally optimistic about the potential of transforming the human race towards a new era of sanity and development and human dignity. So let's have fun. Let's do it.
Barbara?
I can only second that. I think it's the year of Beethoven and LaRouche as we started out. So let's make it.
That's right. That's the title of our EIR this week. It's the year of Beethoven and LaRouche.
Right.
Okay,
very good. We will send out that link to everyone, which contains various performances of the Beethoven opera Fidelio. We invite you all, of course, to be involved in our class series. There will be another phone call on Monday for people who are part of the activist corps. We want to build these committees of correspondence, and I think everybody should think about helping us do that at a record pace over the next month. And so on behalf of the LaRouche Political Action Committee, we're going to end tonight's call. We will have this call transcribed and available to people, and we'll see you next week.
This session is no longer being recorded. Goodbye.